this? What the?
Prepare yourself, ye men of God. This is the trial of your faith.
Who is she?
Ask her.
Hey everybody, Jeff Camrod here. I wanted to make this video here to promote the new movie that just finished up with Shiloh Films, The Overmountain 2, The Price of Freedom. As most of you know, I've had the privilege of being able to work on this and act in this film, and my character's name is Jonas Kentway. I wanted to make this video here so you can see a little bit of my character in action, and I really hope you enjoy it. So without further ado, let's watch the video.
Do what you're paid to do, Oliver. Jonas.
If we fall under attack, there's only so much we can do.
Natives just over that rise.
Lucius, get off of me!
Nolan took a shot at them.
He wasn't alone. We need to draw him away.
Just let him up.
What do you see?
Nothing. It's as if there is no life. Don't even wrote it no badge.
The defense for Elder Past will proceed. You may call your first witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. I would like to call Oswald of Jamnitz to the stand.
Your Honor, if I may, it appears that this witness must have overslept. Perhaps we should call on another? Someone less lazy or more punctual.
Prepare yourself, ye men of God. This is the trial of your faith.
Who is she?
Ask her.
Paul makes a statement in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 in verse 12. He says this, "So then death worketh in us, but life in you." In order for us to ever be advantageous to somebody, to help them, to be a blessing, we have to die in order that they might live. Things must die that we must live physically. At the same time, if the work of God is going to live, we've got to die. If I as an individual want to help somebody, I've got to die that they might live. Now, I'm not talking about necessarily the living as a physical life, but I'm talking about the life, maybe the life of the ministry. I've got to die that the ministry might live. If I die and I crucify certain elements of my life, I'll be able to go to the mission field, and I'll be able to preach, and I'll be able to do what God would have me to do, that those people now will have a church, a ministry, and a place to bring their family. So I must die that they might live. And this is what Paul is telling the church at Corinth, that I die daily, that I must die that you might live. You know what happens when we think about ourselves? We kill the work of God. I think about my lust, I think about my desire, I think about what I want, the work will die. And that's what happens. What could have been? What could have been if God's people would understand and realize that we've got to die in order for the work to live? What could have been if God's people would stop living for themselves and start living for the cause? But if we would die, others might live. If we will submit ourselves and do what is right, crucify certain elements about us, put it to death, mortify ourselves, put ourselves to death, that others might live. And the only way that a ministry can survive is that people die. People must die in order for ministries to live. Paul told the church at Corinth, he said, "So then death worketh in us, but life in you." So Paul knew what it was like, and he preached about it. He preached about dying. He preached about himself dying daily. And what I'm talking about putting to death is the old man. Knowing this, that our old man is crucified with him, that the body of sin might be destroyed, that henceforth we should not serve sin. For he that is dead is free from sin. For he that is dead, the he here is the old man. When the old man is dead, you are free from sin. You know why the ministry is not what it could have been? You look at the people that have left the ministry. You look at people that have left church. What could have been if God's people would die to sin? What could have been in the work here at Shiloh? What could have been how much we could have done for God? What could have been if God's people would learn to put the old man down? But if we don't put the old man down, we will obey the lust of our flesh, and everyone suffers. And Paul said, I die daily that you might live. You understand what Paul's saying? I die daily that you might have a church. I die daily that you might have sermons. I die daily that you might have missionaries. I die daily that your family might hear and know how to be saved. I die daily that I could pray for you. I die daily. In other words, I crucify my lust and flesh. Why do we do what we do? Why do we live in sin? Why do we get involved in immorality? It's all because of the old man. And because we do that, it affects the ministry. It affects your involvement. It affects what you can do. But we just don't get it. Others die because of our selfish behavior. Because somebody brought the old man to church. They brought the old man. They brought their affections and they brought their lust, what they've been involved in the previous day, what they were involved in the previous week, what they had been involved in the previous year. God knows. And they come, they sit and act as though everything is okay. And then others will pray, they'll fast, and they'll say, Lord, I have great fellowship with you on a personal one-on-one basis. But Lord, when I go to the meeting house and we assemble together as a habitation of God through the Spirit, God, where are you? You're not, I don't feel your presence. Lord, what is the matter? Listen, it is...
All right, this morning, if you have your lesson handy there, Assurance of Doctrine Through History, and you can follow along with us if you're viewing the broadcast this morning. And I want to say thank the Lord, Brother Inicio got us back on radio. Amen. Brother Inicio, he's quite knowledgeable in regard to these kind of things, website building and all, and I asked him if he could help us with our radio and if he could get us on radio, and he did. He just said, well, you're on, and he had us a radio station set up and going, and he already had sermons on it. And so I'm grateful for that, and so we'll be incorporating that back into the website where we'll have radio again. And I want to say thank you to Brother Nisio for helping us. And if he's listening and watching the broadcast this morning, I want to say thank you to him for that, and we appreciate that very much. And of course, you know we were on radio at one time, but we lost that station, and then we were looking for the best option, and it looked like Brother Nisio had it. And so we're going to be incorporating the radio station back into our website, as I mentioned, along with programming more so. And then when you're traveling, you'll be able to listen to the broadcast live without using a lot of data. Of course, you can do it now by using the streaming, but it's going to be more glitchy as you're traveling down the road with you getting weak signals and all. But so we're glad for that. We'll be back on radio, and I'm thankful that Inicio helped us. So thank you, Brother Inicio, for helping us with the radio. And this morning we'll pick up on the bottom of the page there. The acceptance and rejection of Christ was based upon the understanding of history. Now, history is an important thing. Remember what we saw last week. When we go back into history, history is a starting point. And when you look at, as I mentioned, the King of Holland during the Reformation period, he had his religious men begin to seek out the origins of Baptist people, because the Baptists were in existence since the time of Christ and John the Baptist. And with the King of Holland, he found that his men that were under charge of this task said, the Baptist people have no founder or a human founder. They go all the way back to Christ and the apostles. Now, the Mormons, the Lutherans, the Presbyterians, every other denomination has a human founder. But what he said is that they said that the Baptist people, they have no founder. And so really what we believe is succession of doctrine. And of course that doctrine is identified by a name. Now, they weren't always called Baptist, but they were Baptist in doctrine. And when we talk about succession, that's what we're dealing with. Now, there's a lot of people today that are called Baptists that do not believe what Baptists believe. And so the name, obviously, is corrupted. But we're glad to be Baptist people. And in the purest form, when we look at Baptist people, we're looking at it from the standpoint of Baptist of antiquity, that we go back in time, and we see the doctrines that they held to, and they held to it very tenaciously. They held to it with their blood. They died for it, as Tertullian said. He was a second century church father. He was also a lawyer. He was also a pastor. He said that the seat of the church is the blood of the martyrs, and that is where the seat of the church is found, in those who died for it. And they've held to these doctrines, and you'll find the similarity, and such as we have the Donatists. They were in Carthage, Africa, and they were there in actually 401 is when what we call the Dark Ages, but in reality the Dark Ages is not so much dealing with darkness as spiritual darkness. The Dark Ages happened, and it was identified as a loss of knowledge when the Goths sacked Rome. And from there, when Rome was finally sacked, and the fall of the Roman Empire in 600 plus AD, you'll find that the Roman Empire, the knowledge that was there was also lost. You know, the Romans had, what we understand was they had running water, they had aqueducts, they had sewer systems, they had, matter of fact, the medical knowledge was there. They had antibiotics, the Romans did. They had sutures, they had surgery when a wound would take place. They had needles, they had the certain sinew thread that they would sew up wounds with. And the technology was amazing with the Romans, but when they were sacked, a lot of the barbarians, they didn't care about the knowledge, and so that brought in a lot of that's what we understand as the Dark Ages. So it went backwards in knowledge. And that's where you had the plagues come in. You had the plagues, from sewer. You had the plagues that came in from rats and so forth. And so the Dark Ages happened, and then eventually coming out of the Dark Ages, I used to think that the Dark Ages was relevant towards Christianity, but that's not the case. But it was during that time of the Dark Ages that there was a lot of superstition that happened, where when the plagues happened, they thought that they didn't think of it being a sanitary issue, but a lot of the superstition in society was dominant in those days, and such as they thought it was the anger of the gods and so forth against them. Now, you need to understand that, because atheists today and the atheist evolutionists, the scientists, they always like to bring these things up and talk about how religion put us in darkness. And if we don't embrace evolution and true science, that we have the propensity of going back into the Dark Ages again, and that's what that Bill Nye, the science guy, says. And that's why they're promoting what they promote, and they're using as a catalyst the ignorance of Christianity. Well, we have to understand that it wasn't the ignorance of Christianity, it was the ignorance of religion that caused a lot of the bondage, where they didn't believe scientific fact as far as the rising of the sun. Years ago, it was thought that the earth was the center of the universe and everything revolved around the earth. And that would be the geocentrist ideology, but the heliocentricity is the actuality of it, where the earth actually rotates around the sun. But as I mentioned before, things that are seen are not as they appear. And from the standpoint, from our perspective, even the evolutionists acknowledge that statement when we have sunrise and sunset. Even the evolutionist, or when you look on doing a flight plan, you have sunset. Even in hunting, you can't hunt after sunset at a certain time. You have that a pilot, as far as when he's flying, so long after sunset. That doesn't mean it's dark, but when the sun sets, that is a defining time limit, being able to fly what is called at night, and there's certain requirements to be able to fly at night. And so you have sunrise, sunset, but yet we know things that are seen are not as they appear. So what we see it as from that perspective, and that's how creation is from that perspective, that we might see the declarative glory of God. And it's not from the standpoint of being in the middle of outer space looking at the earth, how things happened, but it's being on the earth itself looking up and how things appear. And that is how God intended it to be. But, scientists will always talk about the Dark Ages and how that religion brought us into that. No, it wasn't. It was barbarians that brought the Dark Ages in. And they didn't see a need for sanitation or science. They had no idea that it really existed when those from the north came down from Europe, Germany, and the French, and sacked Rome, and just tried to take all the wealth that they possibly could. But society went back in time as far as knowledge, and so you had they lost a lot when Rome fell, and it put the world back into a dark age. And we look at the aspect, though, of the acceptance and rejection of Christ, and the aspect of history. When we look at history, when things began, Christ didn't begin in the Reformation. Baptists did not begin in the Reformation. Christianity did not begin in the Reformation. What we believe as Baptist people and the doctrine that we hold to is proven by an historical fact that it started with Christ and the apostles. But when we look back in time, when we find different periods of time where these doctrines are believed and practiced, that is not the historical base. That is what we understand as perpetuity. So we look at it, we go back in time, we find it. It's not where it began, we see it evidenced, and that now for us is perpetuity. When you look at the Lutherans, and when you go back into the 1500s, that is history, and that is the origin of the Lutherans, or Calvin, the Presbyterians, or the Wesleys, the Methodists. There's no perpetuity there. That's the beginning. So when you go back in history, you see the beginning of it. That's when it began. Or Catholicism, that's where it began at a certain period of time. Well, some say 310, 325. But nevertheless, you have Catholicism under Constantine. So that is the origin of its beginning. And thereafter, you'll have a perpetuity. So there's perpetuity to all things, such as I mentioned, the Lutherans, there's perpetuity to them. You have the Catholics, there's a perpetuity to them. The Wesleyites, the Methodists, there's perpetuity there. And also with the Baptist people, there's perpetuity. And perpetuity is not the beginning when it began. That is the historical base when it was started, and that happened with Christ. It started on the banks of the Jordan River. That's when the church was established. And the baptism, they baptized people into the church of Christ that he started there. He taught them, and then he empowered them at Pentecost. But the church was started during the time and the ministry of Christ. Just as we see in the allegory there in 1 Corinthians 10, they were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They drank of that water, they ate of that meat. And that is the gathering of the nation of Israel as a people. They were a distinct, separated people, and they were a nation. But they did not receive the power as a nation until they were empowered by the law that came from Mount Sinai. And when Moses came down from Mount Sinai, does anybody know how that is celebrated by what feast? When Moses came down Mount Sinai with the laws of God in his arms, what feast did the Jews have to celebrate that occurrence? And that is what empowered the nation of Israel at that time. Does anybody know what it was? No, it was a Pentecost. It was Pentecost. Now, isn't that amazing? Now, what's that? No, it was Pentecost when he came down from the mount. And it was, they call it the Feast of Weeks, I believe it is, but that is what we understand as Pentecost. So we have the children of Israel. They were baptized into a people as a nation. The Bible calls us a peculiar people. We're a nation, a holy nation. And we were in existence. So Israel was in existence before they received the First Testament. Now, a lot of folks will say, well, you can't have a New Testament church until you have the death of the testator. Well, you had the nation of Israel. They were the church in the wilderness. They were a nation. They were a people. They were baptized unto Moses, and they ate of that manna, which is a type of the Lord's Supper. They drank of that rock, which is a type of that covenant. That rock was Christ, and that was the drink. So they were in existence, and they gathered around the mount, and that is Mount Sinai. The receiving of the law is what empowered them, not what started them. What started them was the baptism, and that brought them as a distinct people, and they were a holy nation. And Mount Sinai is when they received the law. Moses did and gave it to the people, and it's commemorated through the celebration of Pentecost. Now, likewise, Christ at the Jordan River, he had his people baptized unto him. And they were baptized into a local church setting, and they were in existence. And at Pentecost, they were empowered. So they were in existence. The church was in existence in the days of Christ, and then they were empowered. Now, a lot of people think that the church was started at Pentecost. That is not the case. You had to have a church in existence to give the covenant to. If the church was started at Pentecost, one question is, to whom then did he give the Lord's Supper to? In Luke chapter 22, who was the Lord's Supper given to if there was no church in existence? When Paul said the same night in which he was betrayed, he took bread, and Paul tells us that in 1 Corinthians 11. He uses that as the model of how we have the Lord's Supper. And if the church was not in existence, so we're using an ordinance that there was no church to give it to, but yet Paul is using that as an example and a model for us to have the Lord's Supper today. So the church had to be in existence at that time, and the Bible also says they were added unto them. Added unto who? When they were baptized there in Acts chapter 2, verse 38, they were added unto them, about 3,000 souls. So the church was already in existence where they were added unto if something had to already be there. So we look at the historical account. So this is history, and thereafter is perpetuity. So the beginning aspect is history, thereafter is perpetuity. We understand. Now we look at three things. We look at perpetuity, succession, and continuity. Continuity is from the beginning to the end. Now, there's a lot of people, a lot of organizations out there. In the beginning, they had consistent doctrine that had a continuity to it, but later they changed, such as the Waldenses. Do you know that the Waldenses later on, during the Reformation period under Calvin's cruel edicts, they capitulated The Waldenses did. The greatest group of history we talk about of our Baptist ancestors, they capitulated, a younger generation did, and they capitulated to Calvin's mindset where they became Protestants. So the continuity no longer is there. And that's why you must have the continuity. So there has to be continuity. What it is in the beginning is what it is now. It's the same. It's identical. That's continuity. That's what we as Baptist people teach, and that's what we preach. Number two, we have succession. That means a starting point that where it came from. We didn't come from Luther. Now that's what the 1641 theory teaches, that we did, but we did not. We didn't come from Calvin. We didn't come from any other denomination, but we came from Christ. So the succession. And succession is done by way of, how is succession accomplished among Baptist people? Can someone tell me? Baptism. Without baptism, you cannot have succession. Now, if you have succession and you have baptism, you have to have the same baptism of John, and it has to be by proper authority, by proper mode, and proper candidate. Proper authority is that it's a New Testament baptism, that it came from John, from God to John, and it was an ordinance of the church that Jesus started. And so it has to be from those groups of authority, such as people that come out of the Church of Jerusalem. The church from there went to, we see the Church of Ephesus, we see the Church of Colossae, etc. We have the Church of Philippi. This is what you have as succession, because churches have authority, and how is that authority delegated that baptism might be a perpetual thing? How is it delegated? Through ordination. That's how the authority of baptism is delegated, through ordination, through the laying on of hands. And so there has to be that succession. Now, a lot of people might say, well, can you prove it? Well, that succession goes all the way back. Can you prove that you have baptism that goes all the way back to Christ? Well, number one, I don't have to prove anything. I'm just to teach what Jesus said. We have a couple of examples of Scripture where the Lord said, upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. That's one verse promise. The second verse promise I can think of is found in Ephesians chapter 3 and verse 22, I believe it is. He said that God is to get glory by Christ Jesus through the church without end. Amen. So there will always be a New Testament church. Also, what we find is what Tertullian said as an example, that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And so what you find in history, this is why we study the history aspect. We look at groups of people, such as the Waldenses, before they capitulated during the Reformation. But let's go back to maybe the 12th century. We see the Waldensians in France, and we see them. We see the other people, the Picards. We see the Paulicians. We see the Novatians. We see these other different groups that were running for their lives and hiding in the wilderness. And we see their doctrinal practice. And we say, well, what they believed is what we believe, so there's continuity there. Let's go back a little further. And we find out where they come from. We look historically and geographically where they have come from. And we find they came from Rome in the time of the apostles, or they came from Jerusalem or different areas. And this is what Paul mentions about Jerusalem, which is the mother of us all. And he's talking about the church in Jerusalem, which is the mother of us all. So Paul gives a validation of succession based on that one verse, where he said, Stephen, look up that verse if you would, Jerusalem, the mother of us all. And I want to look at that verse, and then we'll go to the lesson. But that one verse itself is a confirmation of succession, that the church of Jerusalem is the mother of us all, and it means that Jerusalem, from there were churches started. We have Paul's missionary journeys, the churches that were started. We have from there into the Americas, into Europe, we have a chain of succession. And we see that historically. So what verse is that? Let's go to Galatians chapter 4, verse 26, and let's look at this passage. And this is a verse of succession, Galatians chapter 4, verse 26. You said Galatians 4:26, correct? All right. All right, well, let's go to verse 24, because here's the allegory, which things are an allegory for. There are two covenants, the one from Mount Sinai, which engendereth the bondage, which is Hagar. This Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and entereth to Jerusalem, which now is, and is in bondage with her children. But Jerusalem, which is above, is free, which is the mother of us all. Now he's talking about, when it says Jerusalem, which is above, it's not referring to the location where the Jerusalem is, but it's the same passage and the same mindset where we're seated in the heavenlies, such as the church that came from above. The baptism of John came from above. Christ came from above. And God deals with us organically. So God comes to us, and the Jerusalem which is from above, which is the mother of us all, as it is written, Rejoice thou barren that bearest not, break forth and cry thou that travailest not, for the desolate hath many more children than she which hath an husband. Now we brethren, as Isaac was, are the children of promise. And so we're talking about the children of promise in the context, and the Jerusalem which is above is free. So we're not talking about the ethnicity Jerusalem. We're talking about the Jerusalem which is above is free. And it's the same thing as we're seated in heavenly places. And I've preached on that in that regard, so I hope you understand the context of what is being said. So this is a passage of succession, that the church that was started in Jerusalem, which is above, is free. This is, see, the church is not earthly, it is heavenly, and which is above is free, even as Jesus said. Let me show you another verse in John 3 to help maybe shed a little light on this. In John 3, John chapter 3, and we're in the portion dealing with the born-again aspect when Jesus is talking to Nicodemus. Now, John chapter 3. Let's pick up in verse 9. All right, you all there? I want you to see this. All right, John chapter 3, verse 9. Nicodemus answered and said unto him, How can these things be? Jesus answered and said unto him, Art thou a master in Israel, and knowest not these things? Verily, verily, I say unto thee, we speak that we do know, and testify that we have seen, yet ye receive not our witness. Now the witness he's referring to is John the Baptist, and also the voice of God. But look in verse 12. If I have told you earthly things, ye believe not, how shall ye believe if I tell you of heavenly things? Now the context of the heavenly things is to be born again. Now the born again will occur on the earth. He's born from above, and it will take place here. And that's what he's referring to. And look in verse 13, it says, And no man hath ascended up to the heaven, but he that came down from heaven, even the Son of Man, which is where? In heaven. Now he said the Son of Man is in heaven, but yet he's sitting right there talking to Nicodemus. Now can you explain what he means by this? He said, No man hath ascended up to heaven, but he that came down from heaven, even the Son of Man, which is in heaven. So where's the Son of Man physically? He's sitting right here on the earth, was he not? But yet here Jesus said, the Son of Man which is in heaven. So what is he referring to? It's the same context where when we read about Jerusalem which is above, is free. So he's referring obviously to the divine origin of that institution. Just as Jesus Christ is in the world, but he is not of the world, just as the church is in the world, but it is not of the world. Therefore, when Paul said Jerusalem which is above is free, he's talking about the church just as Jesus was sitting here physically, and he said, yet the Son of Man is in heaven. He's referring to the origin of where he is, and he has not lost that position. Just as the church is here, does not lose its position as being heavenly or in heaven, an institution from heaven itself. So we know that God sent the Son, and we know that Christ occupied an earthly body, and so he is on earth, yet he said in heaven, referring to that where he is from and where he belongs, and he shall not remove from that position. Any questions on that? Does that make sense? All right. Well, let's go to the lesson. Now, if you have a question, raise your hand. We'll take the question. So, understanding the aspect of history and perpetuity and continuity and succession. Three other things let me throw in here. Now, we understand succession, where it's from. Perpetuity is a point in history going forward. That's perpetuity. We see a perpetual continuity is what we see. So we have success. Now, you need to remember this for your own sake as well as telling others. So we have the succession, where it's from, perpetual, anytime in history, forward, even present tense, is to be perpetual. But more so in history do we see perpetual. Perpetual continuing on as it was in the beginning. That's continuity, so perpetual. And so we have continuity, succession, and perpetuity. Here are three other things that dovetail with this. Number one, we trace succession historically, doctrinally, and geographically. And so when we deal with the historical aspect, we say we go back in history, and when we're looking in history, what we're trying to find are points in time where people believe something. And they believed it, we say, well, we believe that, well, that's perpetual. And then we look at, well, do we go further back in time? Well, these people here believe what they believe in Jerusalem. And they practice what they believe there in Jerusalem. They practice these things. And so we have the historical account, we have the geographical. So we look at geographically, where were these people at? Well, we look geographically, we look through France, we look in in Switzerland, we see it geographically, and all through the Middle East. And we see where it was. We see in Africa itself, in the northern portion there of Carthage. And that was what was called the Donatists. Now they were called that by names because of certain leaders, certain pastors that led them, and they were identified by those names. But yet, it's just a name. But yet one thing that separates us from everybody else, one specific doctrine stands out more than anything else, and this is the only one doctrine that divides everyone. Does anybody know what that doctrine is? Baptism. We don't have division over the virgin birth. Catholics believe that. Lutherans believe that. We don't have division over the resurrection. Charismatics believe that. The Pentecostals believe that. The Catholics say they believe it. We don't have a division over these things. The one thing we have a division over is baptism, because baptism in water places you in a body. And there's only one baptism that will work, and that has to be the baptism from Jerusalem. And so the reason why there is this division is when you come to the Lutherans or you come to the Catholics, as an example, well, they started in the 4th century. Well, if we were to say the water baptism is the scriptural baptism, and without that you don't have a scriptural church, well, they're going to get upset because that nails them right there. Well, let's go a little further. We have King Henry VIII, and he started what was known as the Episcopalians there, the Church of England. And from there comes the Wesleys, and they come the Methodists. Or you'll have the Presbyterians. From there comes the Bible churches, or the Nazarene churches. Now, these people may be good people as people go, but yet their doctrine, for us to say that you are an illegitimate church, there's going to be division over that. And so baptism is the only thing that causes that division, because they started with men. And so when we talk about there has to be succession, and there has always been a group of people that have been in existence since the time of Christ, and these people are called the Baptist people. They're always identified. Even in the 2nd century, they were identified by the persecutors as Baptist. They called them, Anabaptist, but they were called Baptist because it's over the one thing, baptism. And that's where the persecution begins. And so they were a Baptist people. So you'll find more so that the name Baptist came in existence more so during the time of religious upheavals, where you had the Catholic institution, you had different churches, organizations being started. And these organizations, we show them that they're illegitimate based on the time they started, and they have not proper baptism, and they're not a proper church. And so this is where you'll find the persecutors then begin to persecute and called them Baptists or Anabaptists. You're baptizing a second time. And so that's where that name came from. But nevertheless, there's always been a group of people throughout history. And we have to guard baptism, very definite nowadays more than ever before. Now, you could go back 100 years ago and not really have to worry about baptism, because baptism was pretty solid among churches. They held to it as they were supposed to. But today you have different groups that have started and called themselves Baptist, or they just baptize and they start illegitimate. And and people accept their baptisms. And so churches go corrupt. And this is why we must maintain a stringency of baptism. Michael, let me ask you a question. Now, you're in the military. Now, I'm not sure if you know this question, but now you were in the National Guard, right? Now, if you went to the Marine Corps, now your boot camp was legitimate. It was basically the Army. It was legitimate, and it was boot camp, correct? Now, if you were to go join the Marine Corps, would they require you to go through boot camp again? Joel told me they did. Stephen, do you know that for sure? Now, you're in the Air Force. All right. Well, the point I'm trying to make is not to say that your boot camp was illegitimate, nor yours. Who else was in the service?
My cousin was in, and they said that, I think he was in the Marines, but now he's going to the Army.
Well, we got to work it this way, though. But what the Marines say, if you come into the Corps, you have to go through their basic training again. Now, what I'm saying is this. There's a lot of people that have legitimate baptism, all right? But we don't know that, and by a person being baptized into the body of Shiloh doesn't mean that their baptism was corrupt. It is simply saying that we want to ensure that we know that it is now. And so even in the military, even though boot camp is legitimate in one branch of the service, whether the Air Force or National Guard or the Army, and yet when you go into the Marine Corps, they require you to go through their basic training. And it doesn't mean that, and again, I say this cautiously, it's not to speak negatively of the training of any other armed forces. I think our military, regardless, is great. It's just the policy, as I'm trying to emphasize what the Marine Corps says, because of their stringency in their training program that they have in the Corps. And that's what I understand. I've heard it from several sources. I know Joel told me that. And they're the organization is called the Corps, the body. And so they have their protocol. And the thing is, the Marine Corps is separate from the other armed forces, as I understand it correctly. So they are separate. And they are a division of the Navy, but they're a separate entity, though. They are separate. They're not like the Army, National Guard, or Air Force. They're separate. So the point I'm trying to make is authenticity. It could be there, a person say, I want to join, in their baptism, it could be as legitimate as ours. That isn't the question. We're not talking about that. We're just wanting to ensure that it is. So I try to use that. We wouldn't, if we wanted to join the Corps and they say, well, you got to go through boot camp, you're not going to say, well, I already went to boot camp. They say, so, good, that's good. You went to a good boot camp, it was legitimate, it was U.S. forces, but you're going to go through our boot camp. And that's what they tell you. And you have to go back through it. So that's how we look at it in regard to ensuring that our baptism are legitimate and trying to keep that, especially in this day and age in which we live, where there's so much corruption in baptisms. And so, a little bit of review in regard to these issues. Any questions or comments before we close? That's true. Right. Yeah, that's true. So, so anyhow, you understand what I'm saying. I'm not. There's no offense. I'm just trying to point to the thing, because I appreciate everyone that served. I appreciate you serving, and Stephen and anyone else that served, and we thank God for that. So, all right. Well, let's go ahead and stop. We'll come back at the top of the hour for the second hour.